Welcome in to the latest episode of that SEC podcast. I'm your host, Michael Brad. I go by SEC Mike on Twitter. And hey, a flying solo for this episode. Well, not officially solo, just without Cousin Shane. Giving Cousin Shane the day off because we're breaking out a new feature for the football season. We are going to be joined every Tuesday by my guy, Stephen Lassan, Athlon Sports, Athlon Steven. Give him a follow on Twitter. This man, he knows college football better than anybody, and there is simply no one better to have on to talk about all these non-conference matchups. I asked Steven ahead of time, rank all the upcoming games and which teams pose the biggest threat during week one college football season. You guys are really going to enjoy the information Steven drops on us here in just a minute when he joins on. We go through each and every matchup here. He even got some thoughts on some of these FCS cupcake matchups. So, yeah, I think you guys are really, really going to enjoy this. Something new to the podcast this fall. A new perspective, a fresh perspective from one of the best in the game, Stephen Lassan. So we'll get to that in just a minute. But, man, finally, we did hit all this on the last episode, but we didn't get any kind of comments on it. Jimbo Fisher down there in Texas A&M has named Haynes King the starting quarterback, and I just thought, we all obsess over these quarterbacks. Jimbo, of course, throws some water on why we don't focus on the rest of the positions like the quarterback. But let's kick it over to Jimbo, who met with the media here on Monday to discuss why Haynes King is QB1 down there in College Station.
Just to make it official, is Haynes King your starting quarterback for
yes.
Saturday?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And what did it mean to this program to you last year? He didn't just disappear. He was on that little card almost looking like an elderly person at Walmart or something, scooting around and helping.
No, Haynes is a very involved guy, just like all three of those guys will be. He's going to do that, man. That's who he is. And listen, any great leader, any great competitor, any great guy he was the quarterback of that team is not going to walk away just because you have an injury or at any other position. I don't care if it's a DB or a linebacker or we act like that's as a quarterback because you notice them more. But those D linemen, guys that got hurt, D linebackers, the offensive linemen, they were all extremely involved in what we did and how we did it. And that's what players that take a lot of pride. That's their family. And listen, you go through the trials and tribulations you go through with your football team. You just because you get injured, you don't walk out on them. You can be there and provide a lot of leadership, knowledge, support. So many different things for the players that are playing just because you're injured, and he did a great job of that, as our others do.
Down front.
Oh, so with Haynes King, what was that deciding factor, a moment that really made you decide that he was the one that you wanted to start on Saturday?
There's no deciding factor. There's multitudes of things over periods of time, and like I've said before, we feel very comfortable with the other two quarterbacks. Max Johnson be a starter here, and I think play very well, and so done Connor Wegman. So, we felt Haynes had a great camp, puts us in a great position to be successful going in right now. And that's what we believe in. And there's no one thing. It's a multitude of things on a daily basis, from on-field, off-field, throwing, running, reading, checking, and effect on. But at the same time, I said it took a while because you had guys that were matching each other. Guys played very well off of each other and kept pushing each other. But we had to make a decision for the first game. So we're very comfortable with Max. Haynes thought he had a great camp, but felt very good with Max and Connor also that, if Lord willing, nothing happens. But, you feel very comfortable in that situation. As we did last year, you definitely need them.
Coach, what jumped out to you and stood out to you about how Haynes handled the process with the offseason to have to come back and sort of re-earn that starting job, just not shying away from that part of the competition and being able to accomplish it?
He's not the only one that did. Everybody on the team did have to come back and win a starting job. We only talk about the quarterback. Every job's up for grabs every day, every game. If you're not performing and doing the things you have to have, everybody can be replaced. We want to make a big deal about the quarterback, but it happens somewhere else. Sometimes it happens, y'all don't even see it. I guess you're trying to say that at center, but I haven't seen that at center yet, but we'll see. But it can happen anywhere. Every job, every day is a competitor, and that's what he does. All right? Nothing's entitled to you. Nothing's given to you at any position on any team. And that's what you have to do each and every week. You practice and play. And he went to work every day. He did it and had some tough days, had some great days, and worked as what he had to do. Improved on some things in which he had to improve on. Felt comfortable in things he had to do, and got to playing very consistent.
Now, of course, the other quarterback competition that we discussed on the last episode, TJ Finley officially named Auburn's starting quarterback. And the way Bryan Harsin tells it, I mean, this was not really even a competition. It was TJ Finley all the way, and it's been TJ Finley since the spring. Certainly, you get the sense that Harsin is really trying to put confidence into the guy that he has named the starting quarterback. And, hopefully they won't be flip-flopping quarterbacks on the field here, and that's kind of the sense I get here. But it also seems like Harsin is, he's just got uber confidence in TJ Finley, which a couple months ago would have been a huge surprise down there on the Plains.
TJ's earned it. Those other quarterbacks, they all competed. They're not going to stop competing. They're not going to stop working. They're not going to stop trying to prepare to go out there and play because they all know, you're one play away. That's just the reality of it in football. But as far as practice goes, TJ's going to get the majority of the reps. He's going to be out there running with the Blues, and we're going to focus on the game plan, what we have to do, and let him go operate and know that, hey, we got his back, and this is his opportunity to go out there and prepare himself for Saturday and then hopefully play really, really well.
TJ, question for you. You mentioned that you charted everything the quarterbacks did during fall.
Coach Keesaw did, yeah. I didn't personally, but we have people that are charting all that.
Did you keep up with his accuracy and how that compared to what he did last season, which was 54.7%? Was it better during your 11-on-11 period?
Yeah, it was better. Yeah, and you hope, your quarterbacks are above that, right? You want to be in 60+% if you start looking at stats and all those things. But at the end of the day, what kind of completions are you getting? And that was the one thing in practice. Practice is different than the games, right? After a while, you're going against the same guys, and you're kind of running the same plays. And at some point, you're really asking your quarterback to be accurate because he's going to have to put it in a spot that the guy already knows he's trying to throw to. I think he did a really good job. And then you go and look at all the individual periods that we did, and I look at just his fundamentals and really all of our quarterbacks. How is their feet? How's their upper body? What is Coach Keesaw and that group on the offensive side really teaching these guys and coaching them up on? And I'm a part of that too. So the accuracy piece is better. I think, just his overall mechanics. And, earlier today I got asked the same question, and I would say this, people improve, all right? And that does include quarterbacks at Auburn, all right? They can improve. They can get better. And it's amazing that what a guy did last year, they're not the same players. They're not the same guys. And we just go back to what you have, video on, you have last year. And I get that. You're comparing it to last year. I get to see him every day since last season and what he's done. So we've moved on from last year with every one of our players. Guys improve. They grow. Competition brings out the best in you. So you bring guys in. You bring a couple transfers in. You bring a high school player in that's a really good player in Holden. And what competition does, it brings out the best in you. And so I see that with a lot of our guys. And you know what? We got good players that are on the two deep in this depth chart here. They're going to keep competing, and that's going to bring out the best, hopefully, in our players. And no different for TJ, but his percentage is better. I think he's done a good job fundamentally to get his mechanics and all that, where he can throw the ball, and he's worked a lot of different techniques where he's going to be better in those areas.
Now, while they've named their starting quarterbacks, Lane Kiffin down at Ole Miss, Brian Kelly down at LSU, still refusing to name their starting quarterbacks. We're going into week one with, certainly sounds like LSU's got that figured out. They're just kind of keeping it close to the vest. Ole Miss, it sounds like it's a complete toss-up on who's going to start with Troy, which is, somewhat of an intriguing game here, according to Stephen Lassan. So just the intrigue never ends here at the SEC West. Ole Miss, LSU making us wait a couple days longer to see who's going to be starting under center for the Ole Miss Rebels and the LSU Tigers. But that's all we got on the quarterback updates. Let's kick it over to our interview with Stephen Lassan, Athlon Sports. All right, we're pleased to be joined by Stephen Lassan. Of course, you know him, Athlon Stephen. He's going to be joining us regularly this fall season, once a week. And Stephen, literally, I told you this before, and I wasn't just blowing smoke. I could not think of a better person to come on the show and bring with us this fall. And not only that, but particularly this week with so many non-conference matchups. And I got to be completely honest, Stephen, I got no clue about a lot of these teams. So I can't thank you enough for joining us and providing some insight that frankly, I just don't have.
Yeah, man. Thanks for having me on. I'm looking forward to doing this every week. It's going to be exciting, and I'm just excited to have college football back. I mean, we've talked all off season about different teams and the preseason transfers, NIL, all that stuff. It's just nice to actually have games on the field, and we can talk about week one, and of course Vanderbilt getting the big win in week zero. So it's an interesting slate. I think for the SEC overall, there's some high profile matchups, and of course there's some duds as well.
Well, before we get rolled into the action, Stephen, can you tell the audience, Athlon Stephen, follow you on Twitter. You're doing an outstanding job. You just launched a YouTube page a couple weeks ago, all CFB 365. But where else can the fans follow you if they don't? They should be following you already, but if they don't, where can they find you?
Yeah, absolutely. So all CFB 365, like you mentioned on YouTube, is my page, and try to post a couple different things every week. We'll have some previews, we'll have some predictions. At Athlon Steven on Twitter, you can check me out, athlonsports.com. I co-host a podcast every week, the Cover 2 podcast. We'll have Monday recaps on Twitter with the Twitter space, and then on Wednesdays with our preview podcast. So Athlon Sports and all CFB, and here as well. Looking forward to being here every week too, talking to you.
Yeah, and like I said, so we reached out to you a couple days ago, asked you to kind of, you know, I don't know if you want to call it a ranking or not, but we're going to run down these non-conference games in terms of which one threatens their SEC foes the most week one. And Stephen, I'm not going to ask you to break down Elon at Vanderbilt, Mercer at Auburn, and Sam Houston, Texas A&M, because the threat there is zero. But any insight at all into any of those teams, or anything, even maybe Mercer you learned week zero? I don't know if you got that game or not.
I think the biggest thing that interests me about Mercer is the team on the other side. That's Auburn. It's like it's been constant preseason drama with the uncertainty with Harsin earlier in the spring. And then, of course, now Allen Green is out. So I think I'm just watching that game from the Auburn perspective just to see, what happens at Auburn and how that team looks. I do think for Texas A&M, they're playing Sam Houston. They are a top 10 FCS team by some preseason polls, and they are transitioning to the FBS. So this is their last year in FCS play. And I think that the thing that I'm watching for is not necessarily Sam Houston, but just kind of seeing what A&M looks like too, with the quarterback Haynes King being the starter. So I think a lot, like you said, all of these games should be one-sided affairs. But I think as a fan, the thing that interests me is the SEC team on the other side, because really the score, it should be one-sided. This is a chance for some of those freshmen that we may only get to see 4 times. We get a chance to see them in those games.
So aside from those three opponents, FCS, which non-conference matchup in your mind, Stephen, is maybe the least threatening to an SEC team this weekend?
I think it has to be Ball State taking on Tennessee. This is a Ball State team that, we've got them picked 6th in the MAC West this year. I think probably going to be fortunate to have a winning record. You look last season, I mean, they averaged about 24 points a game and they gave up about 28, but they found their way to a bowl game. So they were right there on the edge of bowl eligibility. They have a new starting quarterback. The strengths of Ball State are probably their skill talent, but their secondary struggled last season. So not a great recipe to have a new quarterback when you're going on the road in the SEC, and your secondary struggled with, and especially with Hendon Hooker coming up. So I expect Tennessee to win this game pretty easily on Thursday.
Well, let me ask you this, Stephen, because, hey, I'm known for saying some wild, bold things. I'm already on record. I think Tennessee is capable of scoring 60 points against this Ball State team. I'm not asking you to make the same prediction, but would it stun you if Tennessee were able to score that much on this team?
Not at all. I think maybe we can use some creative math in this. Vanderbilt just scored 60. I know they had a couple of they had a defensive touchdown in there. But Tennessee's got a better offense. And, Ball State's probably in the 100s as well, right there close to Hawaii. So I don't know if I would go 60s, but I think Tennessee's going to score a lot on Thursday night.
Now, do you think, you mentioned, I believe, a new quarterback, any chance, not that they can score with Tennessee, but everybody perceives Tennessee's defense as the weaker side for obvious reasons because the offense is so good. But do you think Ball State will be able to put up a couple touchdowns on Tennessee, or is that asking too much?
I don't know if it's asking too much because you get into one of those situations where like late third quarter, fourth quarter, some of the backups come in, maybe they move the ball. This Ball State offense wasn't very explosive last year. They're pretty methodical. Their head coach is Mike New. He's been in the NFL for a little bit. He played quarterback at Ball State, so he runs a very quarterback kind of friendly offense. But they weren't very explosive, and I know their skill talent's good. It's just hard to see them being able to keep pace in a game like this with Tennessee.
Right. And I know they've made 2 consecutive bowls. So, an average team, but certainly not one of the worst teams in the country. But so who's your next team you're looking at that's maybe the least threatening to an SEC opponent?
Yeah, I think Louisiana Tech taking on Missouri. I
Hmm.
have a lot of intrigue for this game just to see what Missouri looks like with Luther Burden, seeing Brady Cook now the full-time starter. Louisiana Tech's a bit of a mystery. They pushed Mississippi State last year and they pushed NC State. They had some close losses. But the question, I think, is with so many changes on the roster, they have a new coach in Sonny Cumbie who comes over from Texas Tech. You may remember him. He was a former Texas Tech quarterback not too long ago.
Yeah.
But they had a lot of close losses last season. But with all the turnover, new starting quarterback, it's Matthew Downing. He was at Georgia a few years ago. So he's bounced around and they're changing systems on offense. So there's a lot of change. There's a lot of new at Louisiana Tech. And I know those games that they pushed those two teams, Mississippi State and NC State, are scary. But with all that transition, they're a really hard team to get a read on. And they were 3-9 last year. So
Yeah.
I think they're a little ways down the list in terms of concern for an SEC team.
Now you mentioned Sonny Cumbie. I got that on my notes here. What kind of offensive system are we looking at for fans that are not familiar with his system, and what you anticipate this Louisiana Tech running with, like you said, Matthew Downing, a guy that's been at Georgia? What do you anticipate this offense to look like?
Yeah, I think the one thing about Louisiana Tech that stands out is they have an experienced offensive line and good receivers. And Cumbie runs an air raid similar kind of style offense. Some, sort of some variations depending on where he's been, a little bit more usage of the running game. But I think that's the kind of offense that you will see. They will kind of try to come out and throw it. They have some turnover at running back this year. So really their best chance to stick around in this game would be to execute in the passing game with some of those receivers. But I think you'd be looking for a pass first offense for Louisiana Tech.
And what about the defense? I believe they return 8 guys with starting experience going up against, not a first-time starting quarterback technically because Brady Cook started the bowl game, but this is his first season being quarterback one. Again, we've got this low on the, potential danger list, but is there any cause for concern there that maybe a more experienced defense could maybe get in the head of a relatively young quarterback?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think first of all, Tech has, like you said, 8 returning starters. They gave up around 34 points a game last season, but they do have experience coming back at every level. And they also added some transfers on that side of the ball. So I think if there's one group for Louisiana Tech that you can project improvement from, it probably is defensively. Those games last year against Mississippi State and NC State, they gave up over 30 points both times, I believe. So I think you could argue last year's group was probably better, and now they're changing coordinators and they've had some other turnover. So I think if you're Missouri, you're probably worried about all of your new faces and the uncertainty with Louisiana Tech. Anytime you play that first game, just trying to figure out, what the other team has, I think is a big question.
Yeah. All right. So who's next on your list of maybe a little more threatening here to the SEC?
Yeah, I think, Miami of Ohio taking on Kentucky is pretty interesting. First of all, I think the quarterback from Miami, Ohio is fascinating. Brett Gabbert, he's the brother of Blaine Gabbert
Hmm.
from he's been in the NFL, former Missouri
Yeah.
quarterback. So he's been there the last couple of years. He's probably the best quarterback in the MAC. And this is a Miami team that's picked to win the MAC East this year by us at Athlon Sports. So yeah, they are a dangerous team because they gave Minnesota a fight last year when they certainly had a little bit more experience coming back on defense. But I think if you're Kentucky, this is a game that you have to take it seriously, especially with the uncertainty with the personnel. Chris Rodriguez not going to play, maybe some other absences too. So Miami with an experienced quarterback going into Lexington, it is a challenge for them. But at the same time, this is one of the better teams in the MAC. And, if Gabbert's on and they have an experienced offensive line, with this coaching staff's been there the last couple of years too. I mean, I don't want to pick an upset or anything, but I think Gabbert could at least make things interesting against Kentucky.
Well, that's funny, Stephen. This is why you're on, because you're on it. But I was going to ask you. I was like, Brett Gabbert, any kin to the other Gabbert that we all know? So yeah, that was my first question. But it sounds like he's a pretty accomplished quarterback, at least for that level. And that they're going to be playing Kentucky, which has a new look secondary. So I don't know. You might be onto something there. I mean, is that a matchup, at least on paper, until we know what Kentucky's got in that secondary? Maybe at least that aspect favors Miami of Ohio?
Yeah, I think that the key for Miami, when you break down their offense, they don't really run the ball like all that much or all that well in recent years. They use a couple different running backs. They lost their number one receiver, but they have capable weapons coming back. So I don't think receivers or talent around the quarterback is an issue here. Experienced offensive line too, which, to your point, I think plays into some of the question marks we have for Kentucky coming into this year. Rebuilt defensive line with some talent, and of course the rebuilt secondary. So I think, for Kentucky, I think someone of Gabbert's caliber with a new secondary would be something that certainly would worry me. I think as kind of you're getting at there.
Any other players on the Miami roster that maybe an X factor that Kentucky fans need to know?
Mac Hippenhammer, all name teamer there. He's one of the better receivers in the MAC. They lost their top receiver to the NFL and Jack Sorensen, but Hippenhammer could end up being all MAC first or second team this year. He's a playmaker for Gabbert. One thing to watch for Miami, they lost both their defensive ends. So if you're thinking about Will Levis and you're thinking about, hey, is this a good chance for them to get the passing game going? They may have trouble getting to the quarterback with the losses that they've had on the defensive line.
I'm going to have to ask Cousin Shane what he knows about Hippenhammer when he's going to think that's some kind of appetizer or something. But what you got? Who's next on your list here?
Yeah, I think Utah State taking on Alabama. I mean, we might need to put Utah State behind Miami of Ohio just because they're playing Alabama. I mean, anytime, of course, it's Alabama. They're probably not going to be threatened too much. But, Utah State was the biggest surprise last year in the Mountain West. They were not very good in 2020. They hired Blake Anderson from Arkansas State. They won the Mountain West. They beat Washington State. They beat Oregon State. They had a really nice season. And they opened up in week 0 with a victory against UConn. They kind of struggled a little bit more than I think we all expected. They were a bigger favorite, around, I think, 27 points, and they only won by 11. They had some turnover issues. I think maybe it just wasn't as clean as we were expecting. I think when you start breaking down this team, there are some things that stand out to you, and it's number one, Logan Bonner at quarterback, one of the better quarterbacks in the Mountain West. Good skill talent on the outside. They have guys like Brian Cobbs, who transferred from Maryland, Xavier Williams, who's an Alabama transfer. Skill talent's not Utah State's problem. And they did a nice job on defense last week of getting into the backfield against UConn with 9 tackles for loss. So they've played on the road against Power 5 teams. I don't think they'll necessarily be intimidated, but man, this is just a tough ask for Utah State going into that environment, Tuscaloosa, to try and keep this one close.
Yeah, and to your point, I was stunned, Stephen. I had no idea, I guess just because I don't pay close attention to Utah State, but 12-3 under Blake Anderson. They went 11-3 last year. And actually, the last 2 times they faced a Power 5 opponent, they beat them. Washington State and Oregon State, of course. World of difference between those two and Alabama, but this is not a trash program by any means. So it's going to be pretty interesting to see Alabama. I don't want to say getting tested, but at least this is not quite the cupcake that I thought it was.
I think if you're Alabama, it could do 2 things too. If Utah State's pass rush is as good as it was against UConn, it gives you a chance to sort of figure out your offensive line, especially coming into the year with the question marks they have. And also Utah State, we talked about Logan Bonner, their receivers are good. that's a group that with the Alabama secondary, as they try to figure out what the cornerback rotation looks like coming into this year, this could be at least a good test for Alabama to sort of work through some of these things. They are much better than just like playing Elon or playing Sam Houston, I think.
Yeah. All right. So who you got next on your list, Steven?
Troy, I think this is an interesting game taking on Ole Miss. When you look at Troy, they're led by John Summerall, who was at Kentucky last year. And Troy's a team that always has, seems like a lot of athleticism. They have a lot of guys who transferred from Power Five programs. I think this is one of the better defenses in the Sun Belt. Carlton Marshall, the linebacker there, was one of our preseason All Americans, and he's been very active around the line of scrimmage. They led the Sun Belt in the fewest yards per play allowed last season. So this defense for Troy is good. They're also experienced. Summerall, of course, being a defensive coach, certainly will only help this group. But the big questions are offensively. I mean, they only scored about 22, 23 points a game last season. They added a couple transfers at quarterback, but they didn't win the starting job. So I think Troy is dangerous from they're good enough on defense to at least keep things close, but without improvement on offense, it's just hard for them to kind of threaten Ole Miss. But Ole Miss has also just so many new faces. There's just a lot of unknown with this matchup.
Right. It's interesting, Steven. I don't know if this, maybe I'm reading too much into it, but I looked into the Troy. They're two deep here, and basically everybody on the two deep is from the state of Alabama or the state of Georgia, which is two of the best high school states in the country. And you got to imagine those kids, every single one of them grew up wanting to be in the SEC. And I would imagine most of them didn't have that opportunity. So, this is like their Super Bowl. This is their opportunity to prove that they do belong on that level. And like you said, John Summerall, I mean, a lot of people view him as a coaching superstar on the rise. He was at Troy in 2017, the last time he was on that staff, and they won 11 games that year. So he knows the route to winning there in Troy. But let me ask you, what are your thoughts? I know we're trying to focus more on the non-conference, but what's your thoughts on Lane Kiffin not naming a starter between Jackson Dart and Luke Altmaier, and how that potentially plays into this game?
Yeah, I think that's what I'm watching for Ole Miss. Outside of seeing all the transfers and seeing how all the new pieces come together, I'm really curious about this quarterback battle, and I think it's a question of, were they so close throughout the offseason that it's a good problem to have, or has one quarterback just not taken the starting job? And so I'm curious to find out where the truth is in this one. I still think Jackson Dart's probably the guy that ends up playing the most for Ole Miss, and especially with the upside. And you don't go out and get a quarterback like that for him to be your second guy. So I don't know if it's necessarily a concern yet for Ole Miss. I think to be determined. But I think if you go back to the spring, I think you probably would have liked Dart to just outright seize the job by now.
And what can you tell us about the quarterback? I believe is a transfer, Jarrett Dodge, I think is how you say his name.
Yeah, Jarrett Dagey is the transfer you're thinking of.
Way wrong. No.
they added a couple, actually. Peter Costelli, you may remember him. He was a big four-star recruit a couple years ago. They've added 2 Power 5 transfers from the portal this year. And I think, again, to sort of build up that offense. So they struggled to get good quarterback play last year. They played 2. Gunnar Watson ended up winning the starting job. So I think Dagey just transferred in too late. I mean, he was an August arrival, I think, after he started and lost the job at Western Kentucky. So I would be surprised if he starts on Saturday. I'm pretty sure it's Watson's job. I think if he struggles, it wouldn't surprise me to see them switch to someone else.
Well, again, that's why you're here, Steven, because I don't know what the heck I'm talking about. All right, who you got next on it?
Memphis at Mississippi State. I don't know if we should we go into this game. I got some bad memories.
Well, Cousin Shane, he has a specific question for you right off the bat. Any idea who's going to be the damn referee in this one? Because he's still mad about last year.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think the good news is for Mississippi State is Calvin Austin now catches passes in the NFL for the Steelers. He's not on special teams. He's not catching any more passes for Memphis. And what's funny is you go back and look at last year's box score, and you're just, it's so one-sided in favor of Mississippi State. And you're like, how in the heck did they lose this game? And of course, it's, turnover that results in a touchdown, a questionable, to put it mildly, special teams play at the end of the game. But, I think for Memphis, you look at this team, Seth Hennigan, the quarterback, is probably the player to know here. Calvin Austin, of course, is off to the NFL, but Hennigan was really good last year as a true freshman, one of the better quarterbacks in that conference. They have a new offensive coordinator. They have some turnover at the receiver spot as they try to build around Hennigan. They also have a new defensive coordinator too, Matt Barnes, who was the interim defensive coordinator at Ohio State last year. So I feel confident in saying that Memphis will get Mississippi State's best shot based upon what happened last year. And keep in mind, Will Rogers threw for over 400 yards against them last year. So with some of the questions coming into the year for Memphis on defense, I think that spells good things for Rogers on Saturday.
I'm glad you mentioned Hennigan because I got him written down here. It looks like he was a Football Writers Association freshman All-American team. You mentioned him, but what kind of, what's his style? Is he a dual threat? Is he a big arm quarterback? What can you tell us about him?
Yeah, I think as we go forward, when you look at Memphis offensively this year, they hired Tim Cramsey, who was the offensive coordinator at Marshall, and a very pass first kind of style on offense. So I think Hennigan fits well into that. And they of course they lost Calvin Austin. They're not really hurting for like athleticism and talent at receiver that they can kind of plug and play. I think the question is whether or not they have a true go-to guy this year, like they had with Austin last season. So I think to answer your question, like Hennigan, much more kind of pocket oriented, the potential to have a better season as a sophomore than he did as a freshman. I look at him as one of the rising stars of the American Athletic Conference.
And how does Memphis defense stack up against Mike Leach's offense there? Defending the pass will be critical, obviously, but getting to that quarterback, any chance that Mississippi State breaking in 2 offensive tackles, any chance, there could be some disruptive pass rush from Memphis?
Yeah, I think the concern I would have if I'm Mississippi State is the new coordinator. Like, not to mention not only new coordinator, you have new pieces on your offensive line too. So I think you're trying to break in all these new pieces and you don't really know what the coordinator is going to do because Matt Barnes was an interim coordinator last year at Ohio State. And he was, sort of just picking up the torch from where they were. Not really sure what that means on a full-time basis. Will we see the same thing that he did at Ohio State or will we see something different? From a schematic standpoint, Mike McIntyre was the defensive coordinator there last year. So they've used, 3-man, they've mixed it up. I think if I'm Mississippi State, I feel good about the matchup in the secondary. Quindell Johnson, Memphis's safety, is one of the better defenders in the American Athletic Conference. But they didn't have too many players on our American Athletic all-conference team in the preseason. So if I'm Will Rogers and I'm Mike Leach, I think I feel good about my chances on Saturday.
Who you got next on your list here, Stephen?
Yeah, Georgia State at South Carolina. I think I have a lot of intrigue about South Carolina this year because of the new pieces with Spencer Rattler and some of the receivers they brought in. So I'm curious to watch South Carolina on Saturday. I think for Georgia State, they are an interesting team. I mean, they closed out last season kind of playing at a much different level. They were hot at the end of the year compared to where they started the season. They had a tougher opening schedule because of some Power 5 opponents. They're led by Sean Elliott, if that name sounds familiar. He was the former South Carolina interim coach and also the offensive line coach. They are very much a run-first offense, over 40 rushing attempts a game last season. So they'll test that South Carolina defensive line that was 11th in the SEC against the run. The other thing is too, you could think back to last season. They gave Auburn all it could handle early in the year. So they will be an interesting opponent in week 1, especially with the way that they closed last year. And also the quarterback switch was a big part of that. Darren Granger became the starter. He's a good runner. He didn't really throw it a whole lot. Not many times was he over 200 passing yards, but they are experienced. And, like we talked about, they gave Auburn all it could handle. So this is definitely not a pushover by any means.
Yeah, it's very interesting, Stephen, because, I've just started doing a little bit of research on Georgia State. Like you said, they won 7 of their last 8. They've returned 18 starters, top 3 rushers, 141 starts returning on the offensive line. They got a guy with 9 interceptions, which is the third most in the country, and their quarterback was MVP of the bowl game. So then I was sitting here like, man, they may really test South Carolina. But can you fill me in here, Stephen, on why you think South Carolina, despite all this stuff that Georgia State's got going for them, maybe should be able to win the opener there in Columbia?
I think it's always hard. I think it's always like one of those cliches. Well, there's momentum or there's
Right.
like all this like positive like things going around the program. But I think if I'm South Carolina, like there's a lot of good buzz, with the way they closed last year too. And I think that this team's going to be a lot better this year. I mean, I know that there's, the schedule is difficult, but still, I mean, I think Spencer Rattler coming in, the additions that they made around him, I think this just having this staff together for the second year makes a big difference. And Spencer Rattler, not everything at Oklahoma was his fault last year. I mean, some of those things that happened were out of his control with the way the offensive line played and some other things. So I think he's one of the most talented quarterbacks in the country. I just think he makes a difference, and you have a lot of good things going for you at South Carolina. But I do think in terms of like danger, if I'm South Carolina, at least Georgia State has your attention. They're not going to sneak up on anybody, especially with the trouble that they gave Auburn last year.
Yeah, so South Carolina, you just got to make sure right out the gate, like you referenced, they had difficulties stopping the run. This is not the opponent to get, tested right out the gate if you ain't got that fixed. And then Arkansas, of course, week 2. So we'll have plenty of time to get to that. But and speaking of Arkansas, we've got a couple marquee games coming up here, Stephen. So who's next on your list?
Cincinnati at Arkansas.
I knew it.
South Carolina is one of those games. South Carolina is one of those teams I'm excited about, but Arkansas is too. I mean, I know you're really high on KJ Jefferson and Arkansas this year, but this Cincinnati team is really interesting. They of course made the college football playoff last year, and they have had some turnover on the roster. Desmond Ritter's gone. They lost some of their key guys on defense. I actually don't think they're going to take too much of a step back. They've added Ben Bryant, who is a transfer from Eastern Michigan. What's actually kind of unique about him is he started his career at Cincinnati, went to Eastern Michigan, is now back at Cincinnati. So he could be the starting quarterback. And if he's not, it's Evan Prater, who is a pretty highly touted prospect coming out of Ohio, more of a dual threat guy. So maybe Cincinnati could play 2 quarterbacks here. But I think overall, like the strength of this team is they have 5 starters back on the offensive line. Corey Kiner, the LSU transfer, could play some at running back. But overall, I think they have that sort of strong culture, strong identity. Luke Fickell, their coach, has just done a good job of building this program up over the last couple of years. So I don't think they are as good as they were last year. But in terms of just danger, I mean, they're coming off the playoff. They have a good 2 deep. They have 2 quarterbacks I think they can win with. So they are pretty dangerous if you're Arkansas.
Now, I don't know if you saw it, Stephen, but Sam Pittman, he had the quote of the week here when asked about Cincinnati and their offensive approach with the new quarterback, new offensive coordinator.
Multiple guy. How big a challenge is that for you all's defense?
Well, it's a big challenge because, they lost their quarterback, they lost their tailback, and they lost a really good wideout. Well, they got to transfer in from Hawaii, who's really a good player, and they've got 2 separate quarterbacks that might, who knows who's going to play, and not positive who the running back's going to be yet. But we do know, and they got a new coordinator, so you don't know exactly what they're going to do, but I think we've got enough defense in that we can attack whatever we see. I think the first couple series are going to be really important to figure out kind of, what they're bringing to the party. Some guys bring iced tea and some guys bring liquor, and you just got to figure out what they're bringing. I mean, hey, go into 2-minute offense. You'll figure out what kind of party you're going to on the first play. They come after you, you're going home. Okay, this is what kind of party it's going to be. Or they'll drop 8 and you got to dink and dunk and get down in there. So the first 2 series on both sides of the ball will be a big, big thing on Saturday, in my opinion, and how fast our coaches make adjustments and how fast theirs does. I think can't wait till half. The game's halfway over at that point. So we got to we got to really get good communication up front or up top and see what we need to see to figure all this stuff out.
Yeah. I mean, leave it to Sam Pittman to put it that way, but really that is obviously a big, mystery of what Cincinnati will look like. But I got a lot of Arkansas fans asking me, Stephen, how intact is this roster? You mentioned some turnover. So, if you can give us a roundabout view of how much of this roster that went to the college football playoff is returning for Cincinnati.
Yeah, they lost a lot. I think the names that college football fans would probably remember would be Ahmad Gardner, the cornerback, the standout cornerback who was the first round pick of the Jets. Also, Kobe Bryant, the other corner. That really, I think, is the one spot I think for Cincinnati that's a little bit kind of mysterious for me, because when I look at their defense in the front seven, I see a lot of guys who played last year, maybe weren't starters, they were co-starters. They've added a transfer from Miami of Ohio at linebacker. So I think their front seven on defense is going to be fine. I think the question will be those cornerback spots and how do they fill in for someone like Gardner, who was so good. And of course, their front was good too. So they sort of worked in tandem together. But if I'm Arkansas, knowing what Alabama did to this defensive line and overall group and pushed them around in the playoff, that's where I would want to challenge them, even with the new starters at cornerback. And maybe you set up those throws to Jefferson and from Jefferson to Landers and Hazelwood. Mm-hmm. So if I'm Arkansas, I test them right away on the defensive line.
Well, that's interesting, Steve, because I was going to ask you about kind of the inverse. Cincinnati bringing back Sam Pittman says all 5 starters on the offensive line, and Arkansas's completely reworked defensive line. It's rare that you would see a non-conference matchup with an SEC team like this where the opponent may have an advantage on the line of scrimmage, but would you go that far? Do you think Cincinnati will have an advantage when it's their offensive line versus Arkansas defensive line?
It's a good question. I certainly think that in terms of American Athletic Conference play, Cincinnati's offensive line is probably the best in the AAC. But of course, there's a big difference between playing, Memphis and East Carolina and stepping up to the SEC and playing teams like Alabama, teams like Arkansas. That is a mystery for me for Arkansas, and just seeing how that group up front fills in, because I'm pretty high in the linebackers. When you get guys like Bumper Pool, you've got Drew Sanders coming in as a transfer from Alabama. So I know they've got 5 starters back, but I think if I'm Arkansas, knowing that the talent that they've had in the way that this group played last season, even with guys like Ridgeway gone, I would still like this matchup if I'm Arkansas.
One final question I got for Cincinnati, Stephen. That we know they went to the playoff and all this. They had a magical year. I get that. I'm not trying to downgrade that, but have they ever experienced any environment like they're going to see Razorback Stadium in your mind? Have they ever played in an environment quite like that?
It's a good question. Last year they played at Notre Dame, which was definitely, I know it's maybe not necessarily, comparing environments, but Notre Dame's a tough place to play. They went on the road and won, but again, it was just it's such a different team that it's hard to say how that, kind of how that stacks up for them. But certainly season opener, Arkansas, after having all that offseason momentum, I think, the Fayetteville will be very hostile for the Bearcats on Saturday. One thing I should note about Cincinnati's offense, tight ends, keep an eye on Wiley and Leonard Taylor, the 2 tight ends. They're very talented. So if you're Arkansas and you're worried about pass catchers on the outside, the 2 guys that are playing the tight end spot might be of a concern for Arkansas as they try to keep this Cincinnati offense in check.
Now we're really getting into some of the best games, not only in the SEC, but in the country, week 1. Who's next on your list?
Oregon and Georgia. I think there's some familiarity, obviously, with Dan Lanning, the defensive coordinator at Georgia last season, being now the head coach at Oregon. And of course, Bo Nix is now probably going to be the quarterback of Oregon. So a lot of familiarity for Georgia, despite all the turnover that they've had. I know that Georgia only has 3 returning starters on defense, but I feel really good about this group going forward. I mean, and you can go with Jalen Carter and Nolan Smith and Keely Ringo as your next wave of stars. You're going to be pretty good. I think offensively too, for Oregon. I think when you set up like a style game, the front for Oregon defensively is pretty good. Noah Sewell's one of the best linebackers in college football. Justin Flo, who's probably going to play opposite of him on the interior, he was a former 5-star prospect. He's just been hurt, and their defensive line lost Kayvon Thibodeau to the NFL. So I think pass rush will be a question. Their second level at linebacker should be good, but their secondary has got a lot of new faces. And I think when you start to match this up, if Georgia's offense has success early, especially with Stetson Bennett throwing to some of the tight ends, and Oregon had some trouble with some of the tight ends on their schedule last year, I don't know that Oregon can keep pace offensively. I don't see Bo Nix being able to win a shootout against Georgia's defense. So I think the Ducks, they're big underdogs, I think rightfully so.
Now, knowing what I know about Mario Cristobal, I got to imagine that he left Oregon with a pretty solid offensive line. How does that group look? And I know they're going against some of them monsters down there from Athens, but do you think they can hold their own in a matchup like this?
I think if you're trying to pick a path for Oregon to win this game, that's where it starts. I think they basically have 5 returning starters on the offensive line. This is one of the better offensive lines in college football. I certainly think it's the best in the Pac-12. So I think that's how maybe Oregon can stay in this game, is if they can get a push along the line of scrimmage, if they can get their running game going, maybe you can chart a path for them to stay in this game. It's really hard for me to see them being able to win all 4 quarters against this defensive front. But maybe early on, the familiarity, the offensive line, like maybe it takes Georgia a quarter or 2 to figure this out. But I think they're going to be fine later in the game and eventually pull away.
What do you anticipate the offensive identity of Oregon looking like with Bo Nix if he plays, and Kenny Dillingham, who of course worked down there for Gus at Auburn? Is it kind of that Gus Malzahn style of offense they want to run?
It's a great question. I think there's a lot of mystery about Oregon's offense because, I mean, number one, I think to your point, Mario Cristobal was, wanting to be physical at the line of scrimmage, wanting to run the ball. They have some turnover at running back and receiver, although I think they feel pretty good about the next kind of guys. It seems like Oregon always has speed and talent and athleticism at those 2 spots. So I think they're going to be okay. I think if you're probably Oregon, you probably do want to kind of stick with that physical philosophy this year, just because Lanning's coming over from Georgia, and the mindset that he has from defense, Dillingham and his past at Auburn. And that's also your strength too, with your 5 starters back on the offensive line. I would be surprised if they come out throwing. I mean, Georgia's had some turnover in the secondary, maybe like we saw Alabama last year. Maybe there are some plays that can be made against Georgia's secondary, but I would not expect Oregon to come out trying to throw it, air raid style, 55, 60 times.
Is there one skill player on Oregon maybe that Georgia fans should be aware of heading into this one?
Yeah, I think Byron Cardwell is sort of an all-purpose kind of Swiss Army knife of Oregon's offense, potentially. He could play some running back. He could play some receiver. If nothing else, he's probably going to catch the ball out of the backfield for Oregon. And I think they have a collection of receivers on the outside that one of those guys could be all Pac-12 at the end of the year, or they all could have about 40, 30 catches and just be a really solid collective group. So I know that I think they lose their top 2 rushers and their top 3 pass catchers, but I still think Oregon feels really good about those guys coming into this year.
All right, Stephen, we only got 2 games left. Who's next on your list?
Florida State and LSU. Man, I'm fired up for this one on Sunday night. I have no idea what to expect out of LSU coming into this year. I think that they will get better over the course of the season, but new offensive line, new quarterback, depending on whether it's Jaden Daniels or Garrett Nussmeier. There's just a lot of unknown for me for LSU. I think if you watch Florida State in week 1, I think they're getting better. They were 5-3 in their last 8 games last season. So I think they're getting better under Mike Norvell. They look great, beating Duquesne. Of course, it was Duquesne. I don't think we can read too much into that. But I do think you're seeing what Mike Norvell wants to do at Florida State. Their offensive line, receiving core, they've added talent through the portal. And Jordan Travis, when he starts, Florida State is a different offense. The 4 games that he didn't start last year, they just averaged 17 points. In the 8 that he did, they averaged over 30. So I think if you're LSU, you have to find ways to keep Jordan Travis in check because he really makes that offense go this year.
Yeah, and Florida State does return all 10 assistant coaches. That's a kind of a rarity now in college football. You referenced their quarterback, Jordan Travis. How about this stat, Stephen? I don't know if you've seen this, but Florida State scored 39 consecutive red zone trips. Is that a sign of just how efficient Travis has been, who it looks like he scored 39 touchdowns in 23 games. So he seems like a pretty a dangerous player.
He is. Yeah, he can hurt teams on the ground and through the air. I think, on the red zone, I think it's two things. I think it's number one, Travis can hurt you with his mobility, but also I think Mike Norvell and that staff, they do a really nice job of game planning from week to week. And I think that was one of the things, last year and even in 2020 when watching Florida State, you could see early on in games, you saw what they wanted to do, but it's almost like they just didn't have the personnel. You could see that early on they would scheme and they would have success, but as the game went on, I think as personnel caught up, they just weren't able to, they didn't look like those Florida State teams that we're used to seeing of the past. So I think one matchup to watch if I'm LSU is that defensive line of LSU against Florida State's offensive line. Florida State was a couple years ago was probably one of the worst teams in the ACC on the offensive line. They're probably middle of the pack this year. They've just kind of slowly been getting better. But that LSU defensive front, if that's where they could have an advantage on Sunday night.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that, Stephen, because I was going to ask you that looks like one of the best individual position group battles of the weekend. Florida State offensive line, LSU defensive line. But let me ask you this: is Florida? We know they're kind of a machine rushing the ball, but is Florida State any threat to pass on LSU, given that LSU's got a new look secondary?
I think so. And I think one of the reasons why I like this Florida State team this year is their additions through the portal. They added Micah Pittman, who was at Oregon. They added Johnny Wilson, who was at Arizona State. They've done a nice job of adding players to a receiver. And one of the reasons why is they really wanted to find players who can win one-on-one battles. That was an emphasis for this offense. So they've added playmakers who can do that this year. We've only seen him once against Duquesne, and it's really hard to know what that means. But I do think keeping an eye on the injury report for Florida State is huge, because Johnny Wilson, who was one of the players we just mentioned, he was banged up on Saturday. They had some injuries along the offensive line, two places where they really can't afford him. So I think to answer your question, I think Travis has improved a lot the last two years as a passer at Florida State. And with these new weapons, if they're as good as Florida State thinks, then yeah, I think they could put some stress on that secondary of LSU.
Now, I don't know if you saw this, Stephen, but Brian Kelly said one of the weirdest damn things I ever heard. But just because it was weird doesn't mean it's wrong.
Is it weirder than the family quote?
Yeah.
Last Tuesday, you said the competition between Jaden Daniels and Garrett Nussmeier was really close. You possibly will come to a decision by the end of the week and maybe Monday.
Yes.
Do you have an update on the quarterback battle?
Yeah, we have. We've made a decision, but I'm not going to announce it publicly. And again, this is for the certainly I think everybody here wants to know who the quarterback is. I get that, but I think it's a tactical advantage for us not to announce it. So I'm going to hold that announcement, because I think it gives us a tactical advantage for not playing. Look, Florida State played a game. That's an advantage for them, having the opportunity to play. The advantage for us is that we haven't played. And so it doesn't help us to give up any of our cards in that sense. So we're going to hold on to that card until game day.
So where do you lie on this? Because this is always a popular, week one topic. Who do you think is more of an advantage there? The team that took the field, even though they were playing a cupcake, or the team that you know nothing about heading into this matchup?
Man, that's a great question. I think if I had to pick someone, I think maybe you'd want to be LSU, almost the element of surprise, because you at least got a chance to look at things that Florida State has done. Florida State's now played, they had a spring game. They've, then they had the week 0 game. Like, you've had a couple opportunities to at least get a better view of what they're trying to do and at least see their personnel and see some of their strengths. So I think you could argue, I think, evenly both ways. I think if you're Florida State, you knocked off the rust. I think if you're LSU, the element of surprise with the new coach is something that you could take advantage of too.
And last thing on this one, Stephen, obviously they haven't named a quarterback. They don't plan to do it till game time. And, I get it. Some people say, well, Florida State's got to prepare for both. But, hell, what have they been doing the last 9 months? I mean, they've been preparing for both. So it almost, maybe I'm reading too much into it, but it makes me feel, Stephen, like maybe they're leaning towards Garrett Nussmeier because everybody thinks Jaden Daniels. So I don't know. Am I reading too much into that? And what's your thoughts on them waiting till game time to announce a quarterback?
Yeah, I think it kind of goes to what we were talking about, like just trying to keep the mystery up and keep Florida State guessing. Maybe you make them spend 2 extra hours, planning for quarterbacks as opposed to like red zone or special teams or just trying to throw as much stuff on the wall as you can if you're LSU. I kind of wondered, to your point about Nussmeier and Daniels, like, it seems like Nussmeier's had a really strong, fall to kind of push this, battle to keep going with Daniels. If I had to guess, I think Daniels probably starts, but I think both of them play. But I think kind of to your point, based upon things that you kind of hear in those quotes, it kind of makes you think that maybe Nussmeier is going to get out there earlier than we think.
All right, so we only got one game left, Stephen. So the suspense is gone. Utah at Florida, that's your number one, and for good reason. What can you tell us about Utah?
Man, I think the first thing is I haven't been able to get a good kind of grasp on this game all off season. And I think the folks at the sports books are kind of doing the same. It's been like a 1 to 2 to 3 point spread that's just been bouncing around. But I think Utah, when you look at the Pac-12, they are the team to beat. They started 1-2 last season. They switched to Cameron Rising at quarterback, Tavion Thomas at running back, and they went on a run, eventually won the Pac-12, made it to the Rose Bowl. They are definitely a contender to be in the playoff this year. They bring back a lot of that team from last year, very veteran. I think, Kyle Whittingham, the head coach there, every 3 to 4 years, they have a team that is very capable once they get those guys in the program and develop of making a run like this. They do have some turnover along the line of scrimmage on both sides of the ball. They lost Devin Lloyd, the standout linebacker, to the NFL. But Utah's one of those teams. They're just kind of a plug and play. You just assume that they're going to figure things out: offensive line, defensive line, linebacker. So I don't know that those groups are necessarily a concern. They like to play physical, and I think that's what makes this matchup interesting. Is they're not a kind of throw it around 40, 50 times a game kind of team. They are going to come in and try to impose their physicality on Florida.
Now, this is something that I was asked to ask you, though, Stephen. Is it Utah? Are they that elite? Because you're seeing some playoff predictions for the Utes, or is it more of a factor of being a really good team that has an easier path in the Pac-12? How would you answer that one?
I think they're in that second tier of college football. I think, if you tier off Alabama, Georgia, Ohio State, they're in that second tier with the Clemsons and Texas A&Ms. On a neutral field, I think they would probably be underdogs to teams like Texas A&M and Clemson. But I think to your point, the path is there. And I think go back to last year was not a great year at all for the Pac-12. I mean, USC was terrible and Washington had a losing record. So some of your usual suspects were not as good. I think this year's team, with the pieces that they have coming back, Cameron Rising stepping up at quarterback, like they could get to 12-1. This is one of the tougher obstacles on their schedule. So I guess to hedge a little bit, I don't think that they're necessarily better than teams like Clemson or A&M. But I think when you study the path and you study the potential to be that number 4 team, especially when those of us who are trying to make picks this offseason are trying to figure out, is it going to be, there's really just not a clear team. They have a good opportunity to do so, I think, this year.
Now, I've heard a lot of good things about Utah's tight ends. Will this be the best tight ends Florida sees until, of course, they see Georgia?
Yeah, this is a good group of tight ends. Brant Keithy is on our All-America team, and I think he's kind of a unique player that they could use him in sort of some all-purpose ways. Kincaid, the other tight end, too. They really have both of these guys great at blocking. Andy Ludwig is their offensive coordinator. You may remember him when he was at Vanderbilt. He's done a lot of similar things from a style standpoint offensively with the way they use the tight ends and of course, Cameron Rising on the way they move the pocket with him. So, yeah, this is a really good group of tight ends for Utah. The one question that I have in this game is, receivers. They did not push the ball downfield a lot last year with their receivers. Part of it was Cameron Rising, the quarterback, had a shoulder injury in 2020. I don't know if he was necessarily 100%. They lost Britton Covey, who was sort of their all-purpose best weapon at receiver this year. So I think when you watch this game on Saturday, I think that is a question: is what receivers of Utah can step up, especially if Florida, if you have Jason Marshall, matched up against one of their other guys, you take them away. If you can slow down the tight ends, can you make some of those secondary weapons for Utah beat you?
I'm glad you mentioned Andy Ludwig, because I thought he did a terrific job when he was at Vanderbilt. And kind of when he left, that was the beginning of the end for Derek Mason. Who do you think has got the edge in this one, Andy Ludwig or Florida's new defensive coordinator, Patrick Toney, with when you consider, maybe it's not fair, but hey, this is how it is. Ludwig, totally familiar with his personnel and who he can count on, whereas, it's, I don't want to call it a guessing game at Florida, but they're going to have to be, learning on the fly, so to speak.
It's a great question. I think I would rather be Andy Ludwig on Saturday night, because if you have an experienced quarterback going on the road, you have a depth chart at running back you feel good about. This is probably one of the deeper running backs, groups of running backs in college football. And we've mentioned the tight ends, and I think Utah is going to be fine along the offensive line. I do like Patrick Toney, the defensive coordinator at Florida. He did a lot of good things with Louisiana's defense. I think in time, Florida's defense will get there. But I think going into the season, if I'm trying to pick a coordinator and trying to pick a side, if you've got a proven quarterback and you've got some proven pieces like Utah, I think that's where I'd rather be.
Now, is it safe to assume Utah will have an edge on special teams? Because I'm looking at their stats. Number 6 in the country in punt returns, number 13 in the country in kick returns last season. Has that been a solid unit for Utah?
Usually they are very good on special teams. One problem is they lost Britton Covey, who was good at returns for Utah the last couple of years. He's now in the NFL, so they will miss him. They usually do a good job of finding kickers and punters and specialists. So it's usually been a strength for Utah. But without Covey, I think that is a fair question of whether or not they can still have that same level of effectiveness over the course of the season.
All right, one final question for you, Steven. Similar to Cincinnati, Arkansas, yes, Utah, they're getting the hype, but have they ever been in an environment like they're going to see Saturday night? Not only the hostile fans and coming all the way across the country, but that heat and humidity is. I feel like that has got to be a difference maker in this game. What do you think?
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, I think if I'm Florida, like I'm checking the weather, making sure it's like 90 degrees and 70% humidity. Like make it as swampy as you can get it on Saturday night for Utah. Which it's a different type of environment, like you said. I mean, it's one thing to go play on the road at Washington State or USC or some of the other venues in the Pac-12. But if you go on the road to play a team like Florida, the first game of Billy Napier's tenure, not to mention just all of the unknown and all the uncertainty that Florida has. I mean, the element of surprise, like what are they going to look like? So that would worry me if I'm Utah. I think you look at the spread and like we talked about, the fact that it's been around 1 or 2, I think kind of speaks to the toss-up nature of this game.
Mm. Well, Steven, this was really, really outstanding stuff. Cannot thank you enough for joining the show. Like, you're going to be joining the show once a week all throughout the football season. You really delivered. And obviously, just listen to that conversation, sharing insights that, frankly, I don't have. So I can't thank you enough.
Yeah, man, I'm looking forward to it. Thanks for having me on. And let's hope we have a great week of week 1 matchups and all these matchups live up to the hype.
All right. Well, hey, I can't thank Steven enough for joining the show. I hope you guys really appreciated all that content. I know I sure did. Steven delivered as always. First time on video too, if you're watching on the YouTube channel. So he was joking that it looks like a little hostage video he's got set up there, but Steven is here weekly to drop some knowledge on us, and he certainly did all that. Any questions you have about your opening weekend matchup, I hope he was able to answer it there. I know I learned a great deal just listening to him there, but you can look forward to Steven coming by, previewing the matchups all season long, so cannot wait for that. But hey, that's going to do it for this episode of the show. cousin Shane will be back on the next episode where we'll have some fun ideas. I've already working on topics to talk about, but went a little long with Steven. So that's going to do it for this episode of the show. I do appreciate each and every one of you for hanging out. We'll catch you on the next one.